All right, we're looking at the book of 1 Samuel. We're going through the Bible at a breakneck speed. First week in January, we were in Genesis, and we're already to the books of Samuel. So, not to go back all the way, but people of Israel were slaves in Egypt, and God redeemed them out of Egypt in the book of Exodus, in the beginning of the book of Exodus. And then he entered into a covenant with them, also in Exodus, and they became his people. He had already chosen them, but he entered into covenant with them. They agreed to do what he would say, and he agreed to bless them. Actually, he sets the terms of the covenant, which is something we should always remember. It's a good deal. Let's just put it that way. If you want to just put it in slang, it's a good deal. All you got to do is obey him, and you get tremendous blessings and protection and everything else. It's been that way ever since Mount Sinai. But either way, anyway, so they enter into covenant with him, and we have all the rest of Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. We've talked through those. They fail him. He remains faithful to them. And then they conquer Canaan in the book of Joshua. He gives them the land that he had promised Abraham. And then we, last week, looked at the books of Judges and Ruth. And we saw that during the time of the Judges, it was a chaotic time. There's just tremendous trouble everywhere. I mean, the people, they would serve God, then they didn't drive the people out, the Canaanites out of the land like they were told to do. And so they were kind of in charge of the land, but they didn't drive them out. And so then they began they went into sin. They began to follow the practices and the idolatry of those that are around them. So God would send an oppressor. Sometimes people that they were living among and they used to have under tribute became tributary to. Sometimes an outsider, but either way they were oppressed. They would, after a season of oppression, they would turn to God in repentance, and he would send a deliverer, and the deliverer would deliver them and give them their liberty and their freedom again, and then they would have a period of peace in which gradually or suddenly they would turn back to the sins of the people around them. And that's what we see throughout the book of, we see it in the pattern. We see the Judges, and then we see at the end of Judges two stories that kind of just describe what life was like among the people, not just the leaders. We had some leaders that were good, and they got okay, and then bad and worse. We have Samson, very arrogant, very prideful, kind of just treats his power as if it's some type of magic potion, does all his conquests for his own benefit, but God still uses that to accomplish his will. But then we have these descriptions of the people of Israel, terrible things happening, and we talked about those at the end of Judges. And yet, in the time of the Judges, there's this bright light, and there's probably other bright lights, but the book of Ruth tells us what God was doing. Even in the midst of all that trouble, God was working, and we see how he worked in this insignificant family in Judah. And you remember, they fled a famine and married Moabite women, and then they died. Mom and the one daughter-in-law comes back, and God redeems, or Boaz becomes Ruth's kinsman redeemer. And we have this picture of Christ showed to us beforehand, but then we find out at the end of Ruth that this insignificant family, God is going to bring, because we know what's happening, God is bringing his king through this family, because Boaz and Ruth's son ends up being David's grandfather. So we come then into the books of Samuel, And there's a 1 Samuel, of course, and 2 Samuel, and this is like the highlight of the year since our class mascot's name is Samuel. We probably should just park here for a long time, just in memory of. Anyway, I had to remember to say that because we have Samuel here. Anyway, the book of Samuel there's 2 of them in our Bible, but really it's one book. The books of Samuel is one story that goes from chapter 1 of 1 Samuel all the way through, I think it's chapter 24 of 2 Samuel. It just continues through there. And so we'll take this week and next week to look at both of them and try to keep them connected in one way or another. The book of Samuel, or the books of Samuel, tell us the story basically of 3 people. There's Samuel, of course, and there's Saul, and there's David. And through these books, we can learn a lot of things from these men. We could look at the life of Samuel. We see him, in his story, we see that prayer is a huge element of his life. It's a predominating element of Samuel's life. He was born in answer to prayer. His name means asked of God. His prayer brings deliverance. Do you remember he gathered all the people together to one place, and the Philistines heard about it, and so they gathered there, and they're all worried what's going to happen. Samuel prays, and I believe this is a story where the valley is filled with water, and the sun shines on it, and the Philistines think it's blood, and they just get they beat themselves. God gives victory without much fighting from the Israelites, and that's from Samuel's prayer. Later on, the people come to Samuel and insist on having a king, and we have a prayer of Samuel there. And then at the end of David's life, we see it's told that Samuel never ceases to pray for the people of Israel. He continues to pray for them. So we have a man of prayer in Samuel. Saul's life is a warning to us. We see a lot of character flaws in Saul's life, or in Saul, which we'll mention a little bit, but when we look at Saul, we should think about our own lives. What flaws do we have? Saul didn't deal with his flaws. He didn't face them. He didn't conquer them, if you want to say. And so we should learn a negative example. He's a tragic character. He ends in a bad way. And if we don't want our lives to end in a bad way, we shouldn't do the same things that Saul did, which is have problems, have issues, or whatever the word is, and we all have those, but he didn't deal with them. He didn't do anything to correct them, to change his ways. And then we have David, especially throughout the first part of Samuel, or 1 Samuel, he's an example of trust. He continually trusts God. He hopes, his hope is in God. There's evil around him. His king, his boss is trying to kill him, chasing him through the wilderness, around the mountains, and all whatever. But he continues to trust God, and he believes that God will oppose the proud, and that God does oppose the proud and exalts the humble. So these are the men, basically. There's a lot of other people. These are basically the 3 main characters that we see in the books of Samuel. And the period that Samuel covers is a period of transition. We had Moses as the people of Israel's leader, then Joshua, and then we enter the period of Judges. And we have these, the different tribes of Israel were ruled by scattered judges. There'd be, this judge, he judged a certain area. Several tribes would go to him he influenced them and he ruled them, but it wasn't like one ruler over all of the tribes of Israel. So the rule of the tribes of Israel by scattered judges ends during the books of Samuel, and we end up with a united kingdom that is established in Jerusalem. So at the end of 2 Samuel, we have a kingdom all the people of Israel are subject to it, are part of it. They have entered into a covenant actually with David, asked him to be their king. They all asked him to be their king, and then he establishes the capital, political center for Israel in Jerusalem. And that happens the story of that happens through the books of Samuel. Of course, there's a lot of important passages, things that we remember. I would say there's Samuel's warning to Israel about a king. There's a lot of important things there. Mr. Reinhardt has probably referenced that passage many times when he's talking about government and what type of ruler a godly ruler is and what will happen, what kind of ruler is not a godly ruler. We have that description in Samuel's warning to the people of Israel. We have, of course, the story of David and Goliath, one of the most well-known stories in the Bible. There's, you remember David's generosity to Mephibosheth is a good passage to remember and look at. Nathan's parable after David had sinned with Bathsheba. And at the end of 2 Samuel, David's psalm of thanksgiving. And there's, I'm not trying to say those passages are more important or more inspired than any others, but those are some significant passages to us. So let's begin looking through 1 and 2 Samuel, and I'll try to describe how it's constructed so that as we go through there, we can kind of see what's happening. And I'm just going to use mime these sections. The first part of Samuel is about Samuel. We have like the first 7 chapters of 1 Samuel tells us the story of Samuel. And then we have the rest of 1 Samuel tells us about Saul. And what the rest of 1 Samuel tells us about Saul tells us how he rose to power and then how he descended in power, how he lost power. And then we begin 2 Samuel, and we are told about David. Now, we've already heard about David because while Saul is descending in power, David is rising in power. Okay, so we have Samuel, Saul's rise and fall. David rises while Saul falls, and then we go into 2 Samuel, and David continues to kind of ride the wave of his popularity and his success and God's blessing. So David's story in 2 Samuel is kind of split in half, and then we have David's sin and his demise and the falling apart of his own kingdom when we have Absalom and all this. And then at the end of 2 Samuel is maybe an epilogue that kind of looks back over David's life. And of course, David's life includes Saul's life, portions of it. And the end of Samuel is not in order, but it tells certain things. And next week, when we get to the end, we'll talk about that in a little more detail. So, the whole book of Samuel has Samuel, Saul's rise and fall. David rises during Saul's fall. He continues to be blessed. The beginning of 2 Samuel, then he falls and his kingdom is destroyed. Not destroyed, but troubled. And then we have the end of the story there at the end of 2 Samuel. So, let's begin by thinking about Samuel. So the first part of 1 Samuel, it tells us the story of Samuel, and of course it begins with, Samuel's not around. It begins basically with his birth and dedication, and in chapter 2, Hannah prayed and said, and there's this song of Hannah, and I want to read it. So if you would go ahead, and you might be close to Samuel, but go to 1 Samuel chapter 2, and verses 1 through 10. And this is after, we know the story, Hannah is distraught, Eli comes, thinks she's drunk, Eli says, oh, your prayer will be answered. She goes home, it is answered, she bears Samuel. She raises him at home till he's weaned, and then brings him and offers him to work in the tabernacle for the rest of his life. And so this chapter 2 is after this. So actually, just to set the context, in verse 28, this middle of, 27, "For this child I prayed, and the Lord has given me my petition which I asked of him. Therefore also I have lent him to the Lord. As long as he lives, he shall be lent to the Lord. And he," Samuel, "worshipped the Lord there. And Hannah prayed and said." Now we're going to read through this, and what we're going to see is kind of a four-part theme that are connected. First, we're going to see in this prayer of hers, or her song, that God opposes the proud. God opposes the proud, and God exalts the humble. He opposes the proud, and God exalts the humble. And then we'll see that despite human evil, she's going to talk about this, despite human evil, God is working, and God will raise up a messianic king. So we have these four parts, and I'm not going to stop and point them out. I think you can as we read through. See when she says things about God opposing the proud, God exalting the humble, God working even when evil is happening, and God raising up a king, a ruler, a messianic king, a promised king. Now we should notice that there's no king in Israel right now. In fact, the end of Judges said, what? In those days, basically, there was no king in Israel. Every man did that which was right in his own eyes. There's no king. But she, in her song, prophetically, speaks of a king. So, she says, "My heart rejoices in the Lord. My horn is exalted in the Lord. My mouth is enlarged over my enemies, because I rejoice in thy salvation. There is none holy as the Lord, for there's none besides thee. Neither is there any rock like our God. Talk no more so exceeding proudly. Let not arrogance come out of your mouth. For the Lord is a God of knowledge, and by him actions are weighed. The bows of the mighty men are broken, and they that stumbled are girt with strength. They that were full have hired out themselves for bread, and they that were hungry ceased. So that the barren has borne 7, and she that has many children is waxed feeble. The Lord kills and makes alive. He brings down to the grave and brings up. The Lord makes poor and makes rich. He brings low and lifts up. He raises up the poor out of the dust and lifts up the beggar from the dunghill, to set them among princes and to make them inherit the throne of glory. For the pillars of the earth are the Lord's, and he has set the world upon them. He will keep the feet of his saints, and the wicked shall be silent in darkness, for by strength shall no man prevail. The adversaries of the Lord shall be broken to pieces. Out of heaven shall he thunder upon them. The Lord shall judge the ends of the earth, and he shall give strength unto his king, and exalt the horn of his anointed, his Messiah. So, this song here is placed here really in the beginning of the book, because those four things become a theme for the rest of the book. Throughout the rest of the book, we're going to see that God opposes the proud, or you will, because we don't have time to go into all of it. But as you read through Samuel, you're going to see God opposing the proud, God exalting the humble, God working even though humans are doing evil things, and God orchestrating the rise of his messianic king, his chosen, anointed king. So this is, in the first part of Samuel, we have that. And then, in the second part, the first part of Samuel, in the first 3 chapters of Samuel, we have this introduction, kind of. And then the rest of chapters 4 through 7, we have the rest of basically Samuel's ministry. And we have, of course, we learn about Eli and his failure as a judge and a parent. And then we have Samuel's call. God calls to him and his remarkable boyhood. And then there's this incident where the Philistines come. During chapters 4 through 7, the Philistines are this ever-present adversary. And they decide to go out to war. And you remember they decide they're going to bring the ark with them. For some reason, they got in their minds that the Ark of the Covenant was some type of it's a trophy that had supernatural magical powers. If we just have this with us, no one can defeat us because we have our Ark of the Covenant with us. That would be one way to describe it. And we know what happened. God does that. That's just like we are this, we have this, right? This is pride. They take this out into battle, and God opposes the proud, even when they're his own people. The ark is captured and brought down into the cities of Philistia, and then God himself, without the people of Israel, defeats Dagon. You remember the story of that? He tumbles over, and finally he's broken to pieces, worshiping at the Ark of the Covenant. And in the meantime, besides all of that, the Philistines themselves, especially the men, are suffering terrible, very painful plagues and all this. And they're like, we don't want this. They, of course, look at it as some type of a magical thing too. They're pagans. But the Bible clearly tells us that this is God doing this. So God, on his own, defeats Dagon and plagues the Philistines. And we see that God opposes all pride, as I inferred. Whether it's Israel's pride or the Philistines' pride or anyone's pride, God opposes pride. And so a truth to pull from that is that Israel must remain humble. And we should pull that truth out too. God has blessed us and given us salvation, but that doesn't mean that we're anything special. Everything we have has come from God. We don't deserve to be proud over anything, and our actions can't reflect a proud nature. Then I believe it's in chapter 7, is where we have the defeat of the Philistines. The people gather together, and the Philistines come there, and they are actually defeated. So then, about chapter 8 begins the story of Saul. And what we have here is the people, Samuel is old, and his sons begin to be judges, and they are not as godly as he is. They accept gifts from people, and they pervert judgment. And so the people clamor for a king. Give us a king. And sure, that's what they were experiencing was not right, but we see from the story of Samuel that what they wanted wasn't right either. They said, give us a king. Why? So that we can be like the other nations. And the truth was, God already was their king. They had a king. They just didn't have a king that they could put a gold crown on and sit on a throne, and that they could look at on his horse, leading them out to battle or whatever else. And they wanted that. They wanted to be like the other nations. And so Saul is chosen in the midst of that. Samuel speaks to them, as we mentioned, about what a king would do and what a king ought to do. And Saul rises to power. He's a tall, humble man, right? He's tall, he's humble, and he rises in power. He goes out to battle and defeats them. And Samuel, after that first battle, proclaims the kingdom again and warns the people of Israel. And then Saul is rising in power, and his head is rising too, right? He begins to do things in self-will. Chapter 13, he doesn't wait for Samuel to come to offer the sacrifice. Chapter 15, he follows the people, or maybe it's his own idea. That kind of story. We could wonder who's telling the truth there. But they're told to destroy the people of Amalek, and they bring the king back and all the animals and all of these types of things. In the midst of this, we're seeing Jonathan as a faithful man. He delivers Israel himself. But in that after the return from Amalek, Samuel says what? Obedience is better than sacrifice. And that's a classic phrase. It's something to remember. And in that time, basically, he's telling Saul, Israel needs a faithful king. Not a powerful king, not somebody but Israel needs a faithful king, because Israel's God's people, and God opposes the proud, exalts the humble. And And he says God has chosen someone else, right? He's chosen someone else. So there Saul has risen to power, and now the rest of the book, basically chapters 16 through 31, we have all the fall of Saul, and at the same time, the rise of David. So David is anointed king. Samuel is fears for his life, because Saul is the king, and he's going to go anoint another king when we already have a king. How am I going to explain this story if somebody asks? You remember that? And they're going to have a feast and a sacrifice in Bethlehem. But David is anointed king. Very unlikely choice, right? No one thought of him when it came time to anoint someone. They didn't even call him to the celebration. He had chores to do. But he's brought in and he's anointed king. A little bit later, all throughout this interweaving, Saul is now being troubled by a spirit. David is found as somebody that can help Saul with his harp playing. A little bit later, we have the story of David and Goliath, and this story epitomizes this idea that it's not family or position, it's not the exalted person, the proud person that God blesses, it's the humble person that God blesses. God uses the humble and the faithful, and of course we see David as this faithful Israelite. This guy, I don't care if he's big, I don't care whatever, he has defied the God of Israel. And God is bigger than any giant. Right? He's faithful and he trusts God, and so God blesses that. And especially after that, David rises in favor. He stays on, basically, or comes back on with Saul's army and becomes what we would say a general. He has a group of men who are his soldiers, and they go out and they always come back and they win. They just win all the time. And since he's coming back with the spoils of war and delivering different people of Israel, of course, the Israelites say, we love David. We like him. Saul is great, but David, whoa, he really knows what he's doing. Saul's slain his thousands. David his tens of thousands. And so David rises in favor, but Saul's envy drives Saul to hatred. And he hates David. And sometime in there, he knows David is going to take his place. He tells Jonathan, why are you even friends with this person? You know if he lives, you're not going to be king in Israel. He knows what's going on somehow, whether it was, but his envy drives him to hate David. In the midst of this, David and Jonathan become fast friends. Jonathan is a special man in the Bible. He's a very godly man. He loves the truth, and he loves God more than he loves position. And he loves David because of David's trust and faith in God. But, of course, David is persecuted by Saul. He's chased around. Saul's story is just full of one scheme after another, and through all those, David escapes. Okay? And David has many, many opportunities to take his own vengeance on the life of Saul. It occurs to me, it's very interesting. What does David always say about taking Saul's life? He says, I can't put my hand against the Lord's anointed. And yet, what do we know about David? He is actually the one anointed by God. He's God's chosen. He's the one that God has chosen to send his super anointed, his Messiah, his king that's going to rule the whole world and not just Israel. He's the one God's chosen for that, but he humbly, full of humility, and not running ahead of God, won't stretch forth his hand against the anointed king, the present anointed king of Israel. So David trusts that God will raise up a king. He knows he was anointed to be the king, but he trusts that God will do that in his own timing. That God will raise up himself, raise up a king for Israel through all the evil of Saul. And of course, there's dozens and dozens of Psalms we could go to look at, but four of them kind of stick out as probably written during this time when David is fleeing Saul. Psalm 18, Psalm 52, Psalm 53, Psalm 57. And then we have the last years of Saul, and we have the battle against the Philistines. He goes down to talk to the witch of Endor and asks her to bring forth Samuel, and that's an interesting thing, because the witch is surprised by who comes, so people wonder whether it was actually a demon or whether it really was Samuel. Well, that just, maybe I shouldn't even mention these odd questions people have. That'll get you, the internet's probably full of all kinds of weird theories on that. But anyway, so finally, Saul takes his own life in the battle with the Philistines. So then I want to just move forward. We'll back up over this next week, but I want to keep going. So Saul takes his own life. It's the end of Saul. It's the end of his life. And we enter 2 Samuel. David, we're told again a little bit, but basically we're told how David responds to hearing about the death of Saul, and he mourns. Here's the man who's been chasing him around. He's all these trouble, so much that David joins forces with Philistines for his own protection and the safety of his family and his parents. He sent his parents out of the country. This king finally dies, and he mourns, and he kills the person who claims that he's the one that snuffed the life out of an injured Saul. And then he writes this touching poem, "How the Mighty Are Fallen." Remember this. And it just shows David's humility still. And so he continues to be blessed by God. And there's this time of a battle between the house of David, or against David, and the house of Ishbosheth, which is Saul's remaining son. Abner there is the general who's trying to prolong the house of the king, which he ought to. The king's lines normally go in families. But God has other plans. The people of Israel, David spends 7 years in Judah as king over them. After 7 years, the people of Israel turn, and they all come to ask David to be their king. David is their king, and in this time, he moves the capital to Jerusalem. And this is kind of a strategic move. Jerusalem actually was not a part of, if we look at the boundary lines in Joshua, Jerusalem is between the boundary of Judah and Benjamin. It's not actually in any, it could be interpreted, let's just put it that way. Of course, it's in Israel, so you think it must be. But if you're looking at the boundary lines, the way it's described, it could be interpreted to not actually be in any tribe of Israel. So David strategically picks a city that no tribe has particular. He's not showing favor to any tribe, not to his own tribe of Judah or to any. And in a certain sense, this city is between Judah and Benjamin. And remember, where did Saul come from? He came from Benjamin, so he's got this city right between the two, what we might say, most powerful tribes at the moment of Israel, but he's not giving favor to any one over the other. Of course, it was inhabited at that time still by the Jebusites, but he conquers Jerusalem, sets his seat of government there, says this is the city of David, and that's why there's two cities of David. Bethlehem is the city of David, and Jerusalem is the city of David. So he conquers it. It's interesting, the location of the city he chose. And after this, he has great military successes. He goes out. There's just kind of like, you could draw a map. It's interesting map study to see the different places that he goes to conquer people and enemies of Israel. And through those, he's solidifying his position as king over all of Israel. And the people of Israel are growing in their love and loyalty to David. And then he decides this is our political capital. We ought to have the center of our worship in Jerusalem too. So worship was an odd thing at that time. The Ark of the Covenant was south of Jerusalem. Shiloh, where the tabernacle was, I believe it was in Shiloh, was north of Jerusalem. I know those two cities are in those positions. And so, where did you go to worship? You go to the tabernacle, but the ark isn't there because of all this thing that happened years ago with the Philistines, and it's sitting in this town. And David says we need to worship God, and I want to worship God here in Jerusalem. So he moves the center of worship also to Jerusalem. This is, we could look at this in a human sense. This is also strategic. I'm not saying, but it is. Everybody's going to come to Jerusalem to worship. Everybody's going to come to Jerusalem to do government work. And David moves the ark there, builds a tent there for worship. And he comes to God and says, I'm established in my kingdom. But you, I have the house. I have a beautiful house, a palace, but you still live in a tent. I want to build a house for you. And David says, that's nice. God says, David, that's nice, but no thanks. I'm going to build you a house. And what does God mean by that? David already has a house. So David says, I want to build a house, a temple, a physical structure, not a tent. And God says, I'm going to build you a house, and he means a dynasty. I'm going to give you progeny, sons that are going to reign over Israel forever. And we will stop right there. That's 2 Samuel 7. Next week we'll come back, we'll review, and look in particular at 2 Samuel 7. If you want to, you could look at that yourself. Be prepared for next week. And then we'll finish the books of Samuel next week. But Samuel is the story of Samuel, Saul's rise and fall, David's rise and fall, and then at the end.